In late summer of 1989, 39-year-old Bonnie Bishop dove into the swimming pool at her local health club in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was just after sunrise, and she closed her eyes as the cool water rushed past her face and chilled her body. Bonnie didn't mind the cold. It was invigorating. Bonnie swam laps every morning. Then she'd towel off and hit the gym for a high-intensity workout. Bonnie was a semi-professional tennis player, and it was important for her to stay in peak physical condition. But this morning, Bonnie woke up feeling groggy, and she had a headache. She hadn't been sleeping well lately, and it was harder than usual to get herself motivated to go swim her laps. But she pushed through her discomfort and propelled herself through the pool, hoping that she'd just feel better once her blood got flowing. Halfway through her second lap, she finally found a rhythm, and her headache started to melt away. But then a searing pain shot through her midsection, like someone had literally slashed her in half with a hot knife. She was so surprised by the pain that she actually choked down some water. She tried to cough it back up, but then her entire body just began cramping, and she could barely tread water. Panicked, Bonnie began to flail, desperate to reach the side of the pool. But every time she tried to kick her legs, they seized up like the worst Charlie horse she'd ever experienced. And so pretty quickly, Bonnie began to worry that she might drown right there in the middle of this pool that she used all the time. Bonnie tried to calm her frantic thoughts and forced herself to just doggy paddle toward the edge of the pool, no matter how uncomfortable it was. And finally, she did get to the edge of the pool, and she collapsed on the steps in the shallow end. And as she hacked up water, a lifeguard who saw this happening raced over to her side. The lifeguard helped Bonnie up the stairs and out of the pool, and then guided her to a lounge chair a few feet away. Bonnie sat down and tried to catch her breath, but she just coughed up more water and continued to seize up in pain. She leaned forward until her chest was resting on her lap. It eased the pain a little bit, so she let herself sit there, breathing slowly. After a few minutes, the pain did begin to subside. She felt sore and very scared from what had just happened, but now she could stand up and walk. The lifeguard asked her if she was okay, and she assured him that she'd be fine, but she skipped the rest of her workout that day and just headed home, trying not to feel too rattled by what had just happened. In more than 30 years of serious athletic training, Bonnie had never experienced pain like that. Bonnie was used to being in perfect control of her body. She really didn't like feeling helpless or vulnerable. For a few hours, Bonnie felt relatively normal again, and she tried to put the incident out of her mind. But that afternoon, the intense pain returned. Bonnie realized this was not the sort of thing she could just wait out. So she called her primary care doctor and made an appointment for the following morning. The next day, Bonnie twisted in agony as she lay on an examination table at her doctor's office. Her muscles still felt sore and full of knots, and so she tried to massage her calves to keep them from seizing up, but nothing she did seemed to work. Meanwhile, every now and again, that incredibly sharp pain kept slicing through her midsection. When the doctor came in, Bonnie, who was all bent over and totally uncomfortable, explained to her doctor what had happened at the pool the day before and how terrifying it had been to realize she could have drowned. She told him about the stabbing pain in her legs that made it nearly impossible to walk, and the dull but persistent aching all over her body. Plus, she was feeling so tired. She was totally miserable and had no idea why. Bonnie's doctor was puzzled. She was an exceptionally healthy woman with no chronic conditions such as arthritis that could have explained her painful muscle spasms, and his initial physical examination revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Her blood pressure, vision, and hearing were all normal. All she seemed to have was a slight fever. Then the doctor stepped back and frowned. He told Bonnie that he wanted to order a complete blood workup just to make sure she did not have some infection. Bonnie nodded, hoping that she would know soon what was going on with her. Her doctor told her that she was welcome to wait on the examination table and that a nurse would be in soon to collect the blood samples. An hour later, Bonnie opened her eyes and found herself staring up at the ceiling. She was totally disoriented for a moment and then realized she must have fallen asleep right after that nurse had come in and took her blood. That same nurse was actually now standing right beside her, and the nurse was apologizing for waking Bonnie up, but she told Bonnie that she really could not keep napping in this examination room. Bonnie nodded her head like she understood, and then slowly sat up to leave, But then a moment later, Bonnie's doctor walked in holding her chart, and her doctor looked like something was wrong. Bonnie held her breath as the doctor explained that Bonnie's blood had 10 times the normal amount of a special type of white blood cell called eosinophils. Eosinophils are supposed to fight off infection, and they multiply when the body is invaded by bacteria, parasites, or other enemies. And so this meant Bonnie's body was definitely fighting something. Bonnie braced herself as she asked, what does that really mean? And her doctor kind of looked down for a second, and then in a soft voice, he told her that an eosinophil count as high as hers could mean cancer. Bonnie was shocked. Before she started feeling this pain, she'd been perfectly healthy. How could she have something as serious as cancer? She put her head in her hands, and the nurse came over and rubbed her back. Bonnie could feel tears collecting in her palms. She felt like her body had been hijacked. She was an athlete. The idea of losing her strength and agility while she went through chemotherapy or surgery or whatever other treatment she would need made her feel sick. But, as a competitor, Bonnie took pride in being very mentally tough, and she knew that now was not the time to break down. So she swallowed her fear and sat up straight. She wasn't going to wallow just yet. Instead, she asked her doctor how they were going to fight this thing. Bonnie saw her doctor flash a small smile at her sudden fighting spirit. He said it would require more testing to be certain whether she really had cancer, so he wanted to refer her to the oncology department at the local hospital. Bonnie agreed, then grabbed her phone to call her mom, Jackie. Bonnie knew that her parents would want to drive her to the hospital and support her through whatever was about to happen. That afternoon, Bonnie felt like her muscles were on fire as she sat in the passenger seat of her mother's car. They pulled into St. Vincent Hospital in Santa Fe, where her primary care doctor had already sent over her lab work. Bonnie's mother helped her climb out of the car and then helped her hobble in through the front doors of the hospital. Thankfully, the receptionist told Bonnie that the oncologist was ready to see her right now. A nurse appeared in the waiting room with a wheelchair and helped Bonnie sit down inside of it, and then she wheeled her down the hallway to the oncologist's office. Bonnie climbed onto an examination table as a tall doctor with gray peppered hair entered the office and introduced himself as Dr. William Blevins. Bonnie reached out to shake his hand and then doubled over as a cramp made her whole abdomen contract. She groaned. The pain was so intense that she couldn't find the words to even describe it. Then she looked up to see Dr. Blevins watching her very closely. He asked her if the pain felt like a toothache, but all over her body. Bonnie raised her eyebrows at such a weird and specific reference, but she said yes. That's actually exactly what it felt like. Dr. Blevins nodded. He explained that Bonnie's high white blood cell count was causing inflammation in her organs and other tissue throughout her body. If they didn't reduce the swelling, the pain would actually only get worse. He said he was glad she came in right away. Dr. Blevins told Bonnie that he was going to test her liver, order some x-rays, and do further blood work. He said that if she really did have cancer, then these tests he was going to do would show him where the cancer was in her body. Despite the kind of frightening details the doctor was giving her, Bonnie tried to be optimistic. She was hopeful that if she did have cancer, that they'd caught it early enough to actually fight it off. For the next hour, Bonnie gritted her teeth as the pain in her body gnawed away at her. In fact, the pain was so intense, she barely remembered Dr. Blevins taking blood samples or the nurse escorting her to the x-ray room. Bonnie kept telling herself that soon they would know what was wrong and how to fix it. Finally, 30 minutes after her last x-ray, Dr. Blevins entered the office, and Bonnie steeled herself, ready for him to confirm she did have cancer. She could feel her pulse quicken and her stomach felt queasy. For the first time all day, she was so anxious that she actually stopped thinking about all her incredible physical pain. But Dr. Blevins said that all of Bonnie's tests actually came back negative. He'd even tested her for allergies, asthma, and parasites, but nothing showed up on her lab work. Now, they couldn't fully rule out cancer because there were some types of cancer that would not have shown up in these tests, but there were no obvious tumors on her x-rays. Bonnie's mouth fell open as she searched for words. She was encouraged that she didn't have tumors, but something was clearly wrong with her, and until the doctors knew what that was, there was no way to treat it. She clenched her fists, partially because she felt so frustrated, and partially because her body was in excruciating pain. Bonnie looked up as Dr. Blevins sat on his stool and faced her. He assured her that he was going to do everything he could to help. He told Bonnie that he'd already reached out to other doctors in the area to consult on this case. In the meantime, they were going to have to admit Bonnie to the hospital so they could help manage her pain, which meant she'd be staying for a while. Three days later, Bonnie lay on her bed at St. Vincent's Hospital, her eyes closed, imagining herself out on the tennis court. Whenever she needed a distraction, she liked to revisit old tennis matches and think about what she should have done differently. It helped take her mind off what was happening to her and the aching pain coursing through her body. Then Bonnie heard someone clear their throat, and she opened her eyes. She saw Dr. Blevins standing near the foot of her bed, and he asked her how she was doing. Beside him was a man Dr. Blevins introduced as Dr. Phil Hertzman, a family practice physician who'd driven in from nearby Los Alamos. Bonnie sat up and tried to say hello, but her voice was hoarse and she felt totally out of breath. Dr. Hertzman gestured for her to just lie back down, it was fine. He told Bonnie that she really needed to save her strength. So Bonnie relaxed as Dr. Hertzman approached her bedside. He told Bonnie that he'd looked over her case and consulted with Dr. Blevins, and in his opinion, it was possible that Bonnie had cancer after all, though not in her organs or tissues. Her high white blood cell count could indicate that she had leukemia, which is a form of blood cancer. This potential diagnosis hit Bonnie like a tidal wave, especially considering the fact she had been told that she probably did not have cancer. Her dad had a friend who died from leukemia, and she knew it could be one of the nastiest forms of cancer to fight. And so Bonnie burst into tears. She tried to catch her breath and calm herself, but the tears just kept coming, and she started to gasp. She heard Dr. Blevins say he'd go get her some supplemental oxygen. Then a few moments later, she felt a mask slip over her face. She looked up, and Dr. Blevins told her to try and breathe slowly. With the help of the oxygen, Bonnie gradually brought her breathing under control. She leaned back on her hospital bed, feeling totally overwhelmed. Once Bonnie caught her breath, Dr. Hertzman explained that to determine if she really did have leukemia, they would need to test her bone marrow, which required inserting a needle into her bone. He'd need some time to schedule the procedure, so she'd need to stay in the hospital another day or two before they'd know for sure. In the meantime, Dr. Blevins told Bonnie to try and rest. A few hours later, Dr. Blevins was finishing up some paperwork when he received a page from a nurse on Bonnie's floor. Bonnie's breathing had been getting worse, and now she could barely breathe at all. Dr. Blevins put his pager in his pocket and sprinted down the hospital hallway. He raced into Bonnie's room and found her leaning forward in bed, coughing and struggling for air. A nurse was hovering around her, trying to fit breathing tubes into her nose to administer oxygen. Dr. Blevins immediately grabbed a stethoscope and moved it down Bonnie's back, listening for any irregularities inside of her. He told Bonnie to please take in a deep breath, and when she did, he heard soft pops in her lungs. He grimaced. These sounds, known as crackles, meant that Bonnie's lungs were definitely filling with fluid. That's why Bonnie was having so much difficulty breathing. It was like her own body was trying to drown her. And that wasn't all. Dr. Blevins could see that Bonnie's body was swelling, especially in her abdomen. It sort of seemed like her whole body was filling up with fluids. Dr. Blevins paged the head surgeon and then asked Bonnie's nurses to prep her for an emergency surgery. Within an hour, Bonnie was out of her hospital room and inside of an operating room. 3 hours later, Dr. Blevins stood to greet one of the surgeons who had whisked Bonnie away into surgery earlier that morning. The surgeon looked totally exhausted. He told Dr. Blevins that because there was fluid buildup throughout Bonnie's entire body, they needed to completely open up her chest cavity to operate, instead of targeting specific areas with needles. When they opened Bonnie up, they saw that the swelling in her body had gotten so bad it was constricting her airway. Between that and the fluid in her lungs, it was no wonder Bonnie could not breathe. The surgeon explained that they spent 2 hours removing more than a gallon of thick yellowish fluid from inside of Bonnie's lungs, stomach, and liver. And while that would keep her alive for now, the fluid would almost certainly come back because they were not treating Bonnie's underlying disease. Bonnie's condition had now become critical. There was some good news, though. The surgeon, during the operation, was able to take samples of Bonnie's bone marrow, liver, stomach, and ovaries. It would let them test her for leukemia and other infections. Dr. Blevins hoped he could finally figure out what was making Bonnie's white blood cell count so high. But the next morning, Dr. Blevins looked over Bonnie's test results, feeling mixed emotions. There was no sign of leukemia in any of Bonnie's tissue, which meant that, once and for all, she really did not have cancer. That was good, and yet her biopsy showed that the specialized white blood cells, called eosinophils, had spread all over her body, and he still had no idea why. Bonnie was dangerously near death, and Dr. Blevins was very worried that she really did not have much time left. The next morning, Dr. Blevins knocked on the door of Bonnie's hospital room and then walked inside. He smiled at her mother, Jackie, who was reading in the corner. Then he turned his attention to Bonnie. He was shocked to see how frail she looked. She was sickly pale and too weak to even lift her head. Dr. Blevins gave Bonnie a half smile, but then he had to tell her the bad news, that he still didn't know what was making her sick, and he was running out of treatment options. He told Bonnie that he was going to prescribe a powerful steroid called prednisone to reduce the inflammation and swelling throughout her body. But privately, Dr. Blevins knew it was just a temporary fix. If they didn't find an answer soon for what this underlying disease was, he didn't see how Bonnie could survive. Now, a few days earlier, Bonnie might have broken down in tears at the doctor's grim message. But now, she just lay there, staring blankly. Looking at Bonnie's hopeless face, Dr. Blevins racked his brain for any possible avenue he had not crossed yet. Then he had an idea. He turned to Jackie, Bonnie's mother, and made a very odd request. He knew it was a total shot in the dark, but it was all they had. The next morning, Bonnie's mother handed Dr. Blevins a paper bag full of vitamins, painkillers, sleep aids, and supplements, all from Bonnie's apartment. Dr. Blevins' request of Bonnie's mother had been for Jackie to go raid Bonnie's cabinets and bathroom for anything that Bonnie might be taking. He wondered if maybe something she was taking contained an allergen or something else that was actually causing her to be so sick. Dr. Blevins excitedly dumped the bag out onto his desk and began sifting through all the plastic bottles. But as he read the ingredients on each of these bottles and the different things that were on his desk, he kind of huffed in exasperation. He didn't see any ingredient that could cause an allergic reaction similar to Bonnie's symptoms. Dr. Blevins leaned back in his desk chair, feeling frustrated. He felt like he was running into another dead end. But just then, the doctor's phone began to ring. He was going to send it to voicemail, but when he picked up his phone, he saw it was Dr. Hertzman, the family physician who'd consulted on Bonnie's case and suggested she might have leukemia. So, considering the circumstances, Dr. Blevins picked it up. Dr. Hertzman explained that a woman named Kathy had come to his practice that morning. Kathy was 43 years old, and she was having trouble sleeping. In fact, Kathy said that over the past 3 weeks, she hadn't slept more than a few minutes a night. Every time she began to drift off to sleep, she'd snap awake, feeling like her muscles were on fire. And now she was having trouble breathing, and she had begun having this agonizing pain course through her entire body at regular intervals. According to Dr. Hertzman, Kathy said it felt like she had battery acid under her skin. Dr. Blevins' eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Kathy's symptoms were nearly identical to Bonnie's. He asked if Kathy also had elevated levels of eosinophils, and Dr. Hertzman said yes. Her white blood cell count was off the charts. Dr. Blevins realized that Dr. Hertzman was essentially telling him that these women's cases could be linked, which meant both women might have been exposed to the same thing that made them sick. But it also meant something else. The doctors could be witnessing the beginning of a new contagious condition, but they had no idea what was causing it. The situation had now become a ticking time bomb. Dr. Blevins thanked Dr. Hertzman and then hung up, but honestly, Blevins was kind of at a loss for what to do next. He got up to grab a cup of coffee so he could think, and when he got back to his office with his coffee, the phone on his desk was ringing. It was another physician at the nearby Women's Health Center calling about a patient referral. They wanted Dr. Blevins to take a look at a woman who had a high eosinophil count and extreme muscle pain. This woman had the same symptoms as Bonnie and Dr. Hertzman's patient, Kathy. But instead of feeling more despair at more people having these symptoms, Dr. Blevins suddenly felt energized. If he could find one single link between all three of these women, he could probably figure out what was making them sick. And if he acted fast, he could potentially save all of their lives. Dr. Blevins picked up the phone and made some calls. And within a few hours, his desk was covered in pill bottles, containers of vitamins, and sleep aids. These were all the medicines that were collected from all three women, the three patients. Dr. Blevins took a step back from his desk, and he noticed that all three piles from each of the three women had something in common. A blue bottle of an all-natural, over-the-counter sleep aid called L-tryptophan. And Dr. Blevins knew that all three women had been saying they were struggling to sleep lately, so they must have been taking this L-tryptophan right around the time they got sick. Now, typically, this supplement was harmless, but Dr. Blevins suspected that something about this one brand of L-tryptophan was harming these patients. And it was available on shelves everywhere, and so if he was right about this, Dr. Blevins needed to act right now before more people got sick. So he grabbed the phone, and Dr. Blevins contacted the New Mexico Department of Health about a potential outbreak. The Department of Health immediately began an investigation, and in November of 1989, about 3 months after Bonnie had first got sick, the FDA issued a nationwide recall of all products containing L-tryptophan. 6 months after that, the CDC conducted a nationwide study and found that all the sick patients, including Bonnie, had been taking L-tryptophan made by a Japanese company called Showa Denko. Showa Denko had been trying to genetically engineer a bacteria that, in theory, would help them make more L-tryptophan for less money. But the bacteria contaminated the batches, which caused 1,500 cases like Bonnie's, and of those cases, 37 Americans died. Because of this outbreak, L-tryptophan was banned in the United States until 2005. Since the manufacturing error was identified, there have been no additional cases of contaminated batches. Bonnie would be one of the lucky ones who would survive her illness, which is known as eosinophilia, but it took a long time for her to resume a normal life. She was in the hospital for a month before she was well enough to go home. It took several more years, but eventually Bonnie would make a full recovery. She finally felt in control of her body again and relished her active lifestyle more than ever. Also, thanks to the doctor's quick thinking, both Kathy and the other woman Dr. Blevins treated also made full recoveries. On the evening of October 28, 2006, in a Florida city called Port Richey, a 37-year-old woman named Marisa Weber walked in the front door of her home and called out a greeting to her mom. Her mom didn't call back, but Marisa could hear her in the kitchen making dinner, and so Marisa walked over to say hello. But Marisa only got about 2 feet into the family's very cramped living room when one of their many cats came bombing into the room and nearly knocked Marisa over as it ran past her and ran up to the side of the wall and just stopped and stared at the baseboard of the wall like there was something there. Marisa was totally annoyed by this cat, and as she looked over at it, she knew what it was doing, because lately Marisa had noticed there were clearly rats in her family's home, kind of scurrying around in the ceilings and the walls. Marisa could hear them all the time, and one of their cats was now clearly hunting one of these rats. And this totally stressed Marisa out. She'd actually begun taking anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication largely because of this rat infestation and really just the fact that Marisa hated living at her parents' home, but she didn't really have the means to go out and live in her own place, which she knew would solve the problem, and so she was just kind of stuck here. And so Marisa turned away from the cat and likely the rat behind the wall, and she made her way through the tight little living room into the kitchen, and she gave her mom a quick hug, and she saw her dad was also in the room as well, and he said hello to her. And then Marisa's mom offered her some food, but Marisa said, you know what, I'm not hungry, thank you. I'm just tired, I'm gonna go to bed. And so Marisa again gave her mom a hug, she said goodnight to her dad, and then she turned, walked up the stairs, and made her way to her bedroom. She went inside and shut the door. The next morning, Marisa's parents got up and they began making breakfast and getting ready for the day, but Marisa did not come downstairs, and so the parents assumed she must have left early for her job. Marisa was a secretary at a waste disposal company. And so the parents just had their breakfast and they too went out for their jobs. And then in the evening, when the parents were back home, Marisa did not come home at the time she normally would after work. But the parents were not actually that concerned right then because they figured, okay, well, maybe she left early and she came home from work early. And so we just kind of missed her on both ends. And that's why her door to her bedroom is shut. She's just come home early and she's in there and she wants to be left alone. After all, she's a 37-year-old woman. She probably wants her space. But later that night, when still the parents had not even heard their daughter moving around up there, the mother went upstairs and knocked on Marisa's bedroom door. But there was no answer. And so finally, Marisa's mom opened the door and the room was totally empty. Now, at this point, the parents did start to get concerned because they're thinking, okay, well, we didn't see her this morning. We haven't seen her now. We don't know where she is. But again, their daughter is 37 years old. And if she wanted to go do something out of the house by herself and not tell anyone, she was kind of entitled to do that. And so the parents ultimately decided that they would just let this go for now. And in the morning, they were sure to see her. But the next morning, the parents still had not heard from Marisa, she had not come home, and now they were officially starting to panic. In particular, the mother was worried that Marisa might have been kidnapped or something going to or coming back from work because Marisa was only 5'3" tall and maybe 100 pounds, so she was really small. And so Marisa's mom called her other daughter, Gina, in a total panic, saying, your sister, she's missing. We don't know where she is. She might have gotten kidnapped. Come over and help us figure out what's going on. And so Gina came over to the house. And when she came inside, she told her parents, let's stay calm here. Marisa, she's 37. I'm sure she's fine. Let's search the house and see if there's some note or something from Marisa explaining where she is and what she's doing. And so the family searched the whole house, starting with Marisa's room, but they couldn't find anything that gave them any clues about what happened to Marisa. But they did eventually find Marisa's purse that was still in her room, and when they opened it up, they saw her wallet was still inside. And so that sent up a huge red flag for the family. They're thinking, why would Marisa go anywhere for an extended period of time without her wallet? That made no sense. And so at this point, the family did call the police and they reported Marisa missing. But the police got nowhere on the case. And so on November 9th, so 12 days after Marisa had said goodnight to her parents, gone up to her room, and then vanished, the family was at a total loss for what to do. But Gina, Marisa's sister, had begun to think to herself, hey, it's possible that Marisa, who was not doing well mentally, she was very unhappy. She was totally stressed out about this rat infestation, which really highlighted the fact that she was stuck at home with her parents at 37 years old. Gina's thinking that it was totally possible that Marisa had just abruptly run away, or worse, maybe she had harmed herself. And so on November 9th, Gina decided she would take one more pass through the family home and just see if she could find any little indication that would give away what was going through Marisa's mind before she vanished. And where Gina started was in Marisa's room. And so Gina, she went upstairs, down the hall, she opened up her sister's bedroom, and she walked inside, and you gotta picture this space. It was totally cluttered, almost like a hoarder's space. There were piles of clothes that were taller than a human person. I mean, this room is totally packed with stuff. But Gina, she took her time kind of walking through the room, looking everywhere, kind of sifting through all the piles of junk and clothes and everything in the room. And she couldn't find anything. But then at some point, her attention was drawn to her sister's bookshelf. And she looked over at it, and she thought she saw something odd right in the middle of the shelf. Now, Gina had a flashlight with her, and even though the light was on in the room, she still lifted up the flashlight and turned it on and shined it at this thing in the middle of the bookcase. And when she saw it, she screamed. Based on Gina's discovery, here is what happened to Marisa Weber on October 28, 2006, the night she disappeared. That night, Marisa had come home. She saw her mom and dad in the kitchen. She was offered food. She turned it down and said, "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." She went upstairs. She went into her room, closed the door, and sat down on her bed. Then Marisa grabbed a pill bottle next to her bed, which contained morphine and codeine, which are two very powerful painkillers. They're opiates, so highly addictive. She popped a few of those, and then she rolled a marijuana joint and smoked that. And then she grabbed the TV remote and sat back on her bed, getting ready to zone out. But when she tried to turn on the TV, which was sitting on this bureau on the other side of the room, it didn't turn on. And right away, Marissa knew that the TV likely had become unplugged. This was something that happened periodically. The room was so packed with stuff that sometimes when Marissa was just navigating through her room, the stuff would bump into the bureau, and that would in turn jostle loose the plug from the TV. But the TV was actually not plugged in right behind where this bureau was. The TV was sitting on the bureau, but the plug ran down and kind of to the side of the bureau behind this huge bookcase that was pressed right up against the bureau. But this bookcase was so loaded down with books and things that Marissa had collected over the years that not only could you not really reach through the bookcase to the wall, but it was too heavy. You couldn't move the bookcase. And so the only way to access this plug from the TV was to climb on top of the bureau where the TV was and kind of reach back and grab the plug behind the bookcase and plug it back in. And so Marissa, who was likely beginning to feel the effects of all the drugs she had taken, climbed on top of this bureau and she reached back behind the 6-foot-tall bookcase and she began trying to grab the plug, but it was just out of reach. And so she leaned farther and farther and farther until she finally grabbed the plug. But when she managed to plug it back into the wall, she slipped forward and fell headfirst into this tiny space behind the bookshelf and the wall, and she got pinned upside down. Now, we don't know why Marissa didn't begin calling out for help. Perhaps she was so under the influence of these drugs that she couldn't really process the situation and didn't know what she should do. Or maybe she was embarrassed about the fact that she had somehow gotten trapped upside down behind her bookcase. But either way, she didn't call out for help right away. And unfortunately, what happens when a human body is trapped upside down long enough is all the blood rushes to the upper part of your body. It causes your eyes eventually to pop out of your head. It feels like your head's going to explode. But the real problem is all that blood pools around your lungs and restricts your lungs and makes it really hard to breathe. And critically, if you can't take a big breath in, you can't project your voice loud enough to call out for help. And so Marissa did not call out for help during those first critical few moments she was trapped behind the bookcase. And then when she realized she absolutely couldn't move, she didn't have the lung capacity to call out for help. And so likely for 1 or maybe even 2 days, Marissa remained upside down behind this bookshelf and likely was aware of her family coming in and out of her bedroom looking for her, but she was not able to vocalize. She could not get their attention, and so eventually she died. Marissa's family would say when they were looking for Marissa in her bedroom while she was dying behind the bookcase, they said they did hear sounds, but it sounded like the rats that were running all over their house. And so they didn't know it was actually likely Marissa moving around behind the bookcase trying to get their attention because she can't use her voice. And then after Marissa died, her family did continue to go back into her room to look for her, and they began to smell something funny, which was Marissa decomposing, but the family didn't know that, and they chalked it up to the fact that the room was really messy, and again, there are rats in this house. I mean, this was not a clean space, and so they kind of thought, okay, the smell can't be anything serious. It wasn't until November 9th, when Marissa's sister, Gina, was back in Marissa's bedroom, and she looked over at the bookcase, and she saw something strange. What she saw was her sister's foot right behind the bookcase. Gina couldn't really process it, so she got her flashlight out, she shined it on the foot, and when she scanned from the foot down, she realized it was her sister. On February 15th, 2004, 2 police officers drove down a quiet street in a little English village called Murrow, and they pulled over in front of this little brick bungalow. Earlier that day, a neighbor who lived on this street had called the police to report hearing a strange digging sound coming from inside of this bungalow. And so these officers had been sent out to see what the sound was and make sure the occupants of this home were okay. Now, these 2 officers were not particularly worried about the occupants of this house. They assumed that some wild animal must have snuck in while the owners were away, and that was all this was. But, as they would quickly learn, that was not the case. After climbing out of their car, the 2 officers just stopped and listened for a second to see if they could hear this digging sound, but the bungalow was quiet, the street was quiet, and so the 2 officers shut their car doors and made their way up to the front porch of this bungalow and knocked on the front door. After a few moments, when nobody answered, one of the officers reached down and tried the handle and found it was unlocked. And so he opened the door just a crack and he called out through this opening in the door into the bungalow saying, "Hey, it's police, we're here to check on you." But when no one called back to them, the officer opened the door the rest of the way, and immediately both officers saw there was a huge problem inside of this house. The entire first floor was flooded with several inches of water, and they could hear from somewhere in the back of the property the sound of running water. And so again, both officers called out into this house to try to get the attention of anyone who might be inside. And when again they were met with silence, the officers walked into the flooded house and began walking straight back towards this running water sound. And eventually, after walking through the living room, they entered this hallway that went right to the back of the property. And as soon as they were in it, they could see there was an open door at the end of the hallway on the left. And it seemed like the running water sound was coming out of that room. And so the two officers, one by one, sloshed down this hallway to this room. They turned left, looked inside, and what they saw completely shocked them and immediately sprung them into action. 2 months before these officers came to this bungalow and found it flooded with water, the owner of this bungalow, 51-year-old Ronald McClagish, had broken up with his girlfriend. And this breakup was really hard on Ronald. He was already divorced, he was totally broke, he had loads of health issues like bad asthma, he had some liver issues, and just generally he was someone who was kind of physically frail. And so this girlfriend had been one of the very few good things in his life, and now she was gone and he was alone again. And so very quickly after this breakup, Ronald fell into a very dark depression. And so for 6 weeks after they broke up, Ronald, for the most part, just stayed in bed and kind of moped around his bungalow, kind of feeling bad for himself. But then finally, at the end of those first 6 weeks after the breakup, Ronald decided he wanted to get his life back together and just move on. So on February 1st, 2004, so roughly 2 weeks before those two officers would come to his bungalow because of this digging sound, Ronald would wake up feeling determined to start anew. And the first thing he was going to do was purge his bungalow of anything that was his ex-girlfriend's. She left a lot of things behind when they broke up. She had not collected them. And so now they were just kind of sources of pain. And where most of her stuff was inside of Ronald's bungalow was in this closet in one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. So that morning, Ronald headed down the hall. He turned left into the bedroom. He opened up the closet. He went inside, and with a trash bag in hand, he began rifling through everything in this closet, and anything that was hers, he would take it and put it right into the trash bag. And at some point, when Ronald was almost done pulling the last few things of his girlfriend's out and into the trash bag, from behind him, he heard this strange sound coming from the bedroom. It sounded like wood bending or creaking. But before he could turn around to see what the sound was, the door to the closet he was in slammed shut with incredible force. And suddenly Ronald was trapped inside of this closet in total darkness. Now Ronald was likely shocked at first, but he would have reached and tried for the handle and found that no matter what he did, he could not open this closet again. And so Ronald began screaming for help and pounding on the door, but nobody came to help him. The closet that Ronald was in was fairly tall, but it was only 2 feet wide by about 2 feet deep, which meant Ronald could only stand inside of this closet. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't bend down, he literally was trapped standing. And Ronald didn't have water, he didn't have food, he knew that no one was going to be checking on him anytime soon, and even though his bungalow was kind of small and shabby, it was built out of brick. And so the likelihood that his calls for help were penetrating outside loud enough that people could hear them and that they would come in and rescue him was pretty slim. And so at some point that evening, Ronald realized he needed to do something different if he was going to get out of this closet. And so above him were a series of pipes across the ceiling. And so he reached up and he grabbed one of them and he broke it off. He was likely thinking that with this pipe, maybe he can burrow a hole in the wall and crawl through to another room, or maybe he can punch a hole in the door and somehow unlock it, or at a minimum, with the metal pipe, smashing it against the wall or the door would be louder than any noise he could make by yelling. However, the second he broke that pipe off the ceiling, something horrible happened. The pipe he broke was a water pipe, and as soon as it was broken, icy cold water began pouring down directly on top of Ronald's head and face. And again, because he can only stand basically in the middle of this closet, he couldn't get out of the way of this water. It was like he was under a waterfall and couldn't go anywhere. And so he likely tried to ignore the water and tried to use the pipe and screamed and do anything he could to get someone to know he was in here, but no one could hear him. And so it was like he was being tortured with this freezing water, and he's in this tight claustrophobic space. It's total darkness and he's totally panicking. And for days and days, that would be Ronald's nightmarish reality. But despite how terrible his circumstances were, Ronald continued to use that pipe to both smash the walls to make loud sounds. He also began burrowing into the walls, trying to make a hole. But Ronald was getting weaker and weaker. He became very sick. And also, because the water was constantly hitting his head and face, his skin got so saturated that literally his skin started falling off. It basically opened up into these sores and began to sag, and the water just began brushing his skin off. And so finally, after about a week of being trapped in this closet in these terrible conditions, Ronald realized help was not going to come in time, and so he put his pipe down, he kind of slumped up against the wall, and then closed his eyes. Ronald's neighbor, who called the police, actually did hear Ronald using that pipe to try to dig a hole in his wall, and she heard Ronald smashing the pipe on his door, and she must have heard muffled shrieks and yells, but she didn't know what they were and kind of just decided it wasn't her business. But when Ronald's house went from all these strange sounds to silence, that was when she called the police and said, hey, I had heard some digging sounds coming from the bungalow, and now I don't. And so when those two police officers arrived at Ronald's bungalow, they went inside, they went down the hallway, they went into the bedroom where Ronald had gone, and they saw this huge wardrobe, which is a big wooden piece of furniture, toppled over right in front of the closet. And at the bottom of the closet, they saw two human feet protruding from underneath that little space at the bottom of the closet. Those feet belonged to Ronald. He had managed to force his feet underneath the closet, but of course, he could not have fit underneath the closet door. And so the two police officers rushed over, and together, they barely were able to get this wardrobe off of the closet door. And when they opened the door up, Ronald was in there. He was deceased. His body was still in a standing position, kind of rigid and propped up against the wall, and freezing water was still pouring down onto his head. It would turn out no one had intentionally trapped Ronald. Instead, his wardrobe was just unstable, and it happened to topple over at the worst possible moment. In April of 1979, a 69-year-old woman named Monica Myers was appointed mayor of a little village called Betterton in the U.S. state of Maryland. Betterton used to be this very fancy resort town on the water where people from Baltimore and Philadelphia would come there for vacations. They had fancy hotels and restaurants and shops. But by the time Monica became Betterton's mayor, Betterton had kind of gone downhill. People had stopped coming to Betterton. All the hotels shut down or were abandoned or burned down. The summer homes of the rich people from the big cities, those got sold off. And down at the beach, all these glamorous boardwalks literally just kind of crumbled into the sea, and in their place were all these shanty towns where homeless people set up their camps. But Monica had grown up in Betterton, and so she really loved the town and wanted to improve it. And so when she became mayor in 1979, she really leaned into her new role way more than other mayors would. Instead of managing the village from an office like most mayors would do, Monica literally went out in town and just began doing lots of jobs around the town for free. She would ride around with the police and literally stop crimes in action. One time, she stumbled across someone looting a vacant hotel, and she personally got out, chased this person down, and made them put everything back that they had taken. She would pick up trash on the beach, she would do random repairs on people's homes and businesses all over town, and sometimes she would just go door to door asking people how they were doing. And so very quickly, the people of Betterton really grew to love Monica, and they loved seeing her every single day just out and about making Betterton a better place. And so, on March 20th, 1980, roughly 1 year into Monica's tenure as mayor, it was immediately noticeable to the people of Betterton when Monica was nowhere to be seen. That day, she did not go to the police station in the morning like she normally did. She was not seen at the beach doing her trash pickup, and she didn't knock on anybody's door. And so by mid-morning that day, the people of Betterton, all 120 of them, were basically out in force looking for Monica. And at 11:30 a.m., the police in Betterton got a call about Monica. It was this guy who was totally panicked. He could barely make a sentence. And he basically just told the police, you gotta get here now. And so the police hopped in their cars and they sped to the address this guy gave them. And when they got there, they saw it was this very plain, boxy building that was kind of tucked back in the woods. It was far away from the town center, and really nobody ever went over here. And the police, when they parked their cars, they saw the guy who had called the police, the distraught caller, was standing outside of the front door. He was obviously crying, and he was waving for them to come over and follow him into this building. And so the police got out of their cars, they ran over to this guy, and they're asking him, what happened? Where's Monica? What's going on? But this guy was so hysterical, he really could not describe what happened to Monica. He just kept telling them to come on, follow me. And so he led them into this building, and pretty quickly they entered this huge warehouse where all across the ceiling were these big metal catwalk areas that kind of zigged and zagged all over this warehouse. And below them, all over the floor, were these huge industrial-sized 15-foot tall vats that contained something. And so this guy who had led police here, he stops and he just points at the nearest vat. And so the police, picking up his cue, begin walking towards this vat. And as they got closer and closer, they were hit with this horrible smell that made them gag and cough. And before long, they had to stop and kind of compose themselves. The smell was so bad. It would turn out this building that was kind of removed from the town center of Betterton was Betterton's sewage treatment plant. And that morning, Monica had gone to the treatment plant to help clean some of these 15-foot tall industrial-sized vats that contained human waste. She had done this enough times that when she was here, she did not need any supervision. And so that morning, she was alone. She climbed up onto one of the catwalks over one of these big vats, and she had reached down with her testing kit to test the sewage to see how much cleaning it would need. And as she did that, she somehow slipped and fell into the big vat of human waste. Now, she would not have immediately gone under. It was not like a liquid. It was more like clay or really thick mud, where at first she would have kind of been laying on top of the sewage. But as soon as she tried to move to get out of the sewage would have functioned more like quicksand, where as soon as a part of her body went under the surface, it would not come up again. And so after the police composed themselves, they climbed up onto the catwalk and they looked down and they saw Monica, who was face down, partially submerged inside of this vat, and she was deceased. Her autopsy would reveal that she died of drowning, which means she literally inhaled human waste.